Good afternoon. I am Pamela Nadell, Director of American University's Jewish Studies program, and I am delighted to welcome you to this webinar, Behind the Scenes with the Filmmakers and Historians of the Florentine Film Series, the U.S. and the Holocaust. It is particularly appropriate that we are having this conversation today, for many of us are remembering that today is also the 4th anniversary of the murders at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Our conversation today is co-sponsored by American University's Jewish Studies program and our Center for Israel Studies. As always, I am just delighted to thank my colleague, Professor Michael Brenner, Director of the Center, for helping us bring exceptional programming to our campus and wider community. And I especially want to thank the Center's Managing Director, Laura Cutler, for making all that we do possible. Everyone at American University joins me in extending a warm welcome to our audience today. You include AU faculty and students, including the students in my American Jewish History class, American University alumni and academic colleagues also from around the country, and friends near and far of AU and of our Jewish Studies program and our Center for Israel Studies. Many of you joining us today were glued, as was I, to our screens when the series The U.S. and the Holocaust, produced and directed by Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and Sarah Botstein, premiered on PBS last month. This documentary about what Americans knew, did, and could have done in response to the Nazi persecution of the Jews justifiably received stellar reviews. The Hollywood Reporter called the film one of the most vital projects in Burns' 5-decade relationship with PBS. That's why I am especially thrilled that today, thanks to the wonders of Zoom, that one of the film's 3 producer-directors, Sarah Botstein, and 2 of the scholars who were on screen, who we would typically call, I guess, talking heads, are joining us, and they are Rebecca Erbelding and Daniel Green. So let me introduce them properly. For more than 2 decades, Sarah Botstein has produced some of the most popular and acclaimed documentaries on PBS. Her work with directors Ken Burns and Lynn Novick includes Hemingway, College Behind Bars, the Vietnam War, and many more. But the U.S. and the Holocaust marks her directorial debut, and what a debut it has been. Currently, Sarah Botstein is producing an epic 6-part, 12-hour series on the American Revolution, and also a project on Lyndon Johnson's life and presidency. Rebecca Erbelding is the author of the brilliant book, Rescue Board, The Untold Story of America's Efforts to Save the Jews of Europe. And it was the winner of the National Jewish Book Award for Excellence in Writing based on archival research. Dr. Erbelding holds a PhD in American history and has been a historian, a curator, and an archivist at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Washington, D.C. for almost 20 years. She was historical advisor to the film and also served as the lead historian on the museum's special exhibition, Americans and the Holocaust. Daniel Green is president and librarian of the Newberry Library in Chicago, where he is also adjunct professor of history at Northwestern University. He curated the exhibit Americans and the Holocaust at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and if you are in Washington, I strongly urge you to see it. It is extraordinary. He also co-edited the book Americans and the Holocaust, a reader, as a companion volume to the ongoing exhibition. His first book, The Jewish Origins of Cultural Pluralism, the Menorah Association and American Democracy, won the very prestigious American Jewish Historical Society's Saul Wiener Prize. So I'm going to ask some questions, but mostly I'm going to let the people on the screen do the talking. So I'm really interested in how each of you played a specific role in shaping the film, The U.S. and the Holocaust. And I actually thought that I would start with Danny Green because I imagine that the exhibit, Americans and the Holocaust, was one of the seeds that sparked this film.
It was, and Pam, it's so good to be with you. So thanks for having us today. Um, yeah, we began the exhibition opened at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in April of 2018, which was the 25th anniversary of the museum. It had opened in April of 1993. We began working on the exhibition in 2014. There's a large team on the exhibition beyond just Becky and me that really touched on so much of the museum staff. It was a huge multi-year effort. But I had the opportunity to meet with Sarah Botstein and Lynn Novick first in 2015 as our exhibition was still in formation. And the exhibition and the film are obviously very different experiences, right? To walk through a gallery or to view a film, but I think there are many ways that the arc of the stories at least intersect and overlap in asking difficult questions about what Americans knew and why more wasn't done to rescue the Jews of Europe. And at the museum, the last thing I'll say is we were really motivated by something the founding chairman of the museum, Elie Wiesel, said on the opening day of the museum in 1993. He said, "This museum is not an answer, it's a question mark." And I think that's a really valuable approach to history, to leave people with difficult questions rather than trying to tell them exactly what they should think about every topic.
Right. I remembered that opening because I was already teaching at American University by then, and I also remember walking through the exhibit before it formally opened. You invited me and a small group of people to see it, and I remember I was just awestruck by what you had been able to achieve in that relatively small space about the questions and the complexity of this story. So I'd love to ask Sarah about how you decided to jump from that into a film.
Well, thank you for having me. It's really so fun to be here, and it's amazing to talk about the film now that everyone has had a chance to see it and to be with Becky and with Danny. When we were working on a film we made about a higher education program in prisons, Lynn actually made a presentation in 2014, and through that we got connected to a guy named Mike Abramowitz who connected us to Danny and to Sarah and to the museum. And in 2015, as Danny said, we met with them as they were putting storyboards together and thinking about how to curate the exhibition and what to wrestle with and how to think about this topic. And, you know, Ken, Lynn, and Jeff and I made a film about the Second World War that came out in 2007. Ken and Jeff have done extraordinary work on a three-person biography on the history of the Roosevelts. And I think we've all tread over this period in American history actually many, many times. Prohibition, Ernest Hemingway, the Second World War, jazz, the 1920s and 30s as a period in American history that is important not only here domestically, but around the world, deserves looking at, and I think over and over again. And so once we heard that the museum in Washington was doing this initiative and exhibition, we all jumped at the chance and actually added this film to a schedule that is very carefully calibrated. We did not expect to make this film. I remember going to New Hampshire and talking to Ken about it, and we put it on the schedule and decided to do it, even though it was a bit of a surprise. And we're all extremely grateful to have had the opportunity to make the film and to work as closely with the museum and scholars like Becky and Danny as we have.
I can imagine what a monkey wrench that must have thrown into your schedule, adding a major 6-hour film on top of, as you said, a carefully calibrated existing schedule.
Well, when we added it, Ken said it can only be 2 hours. If we're going to add it, it can't be longer than 2 hours. And he tried to stick to that for a while, but yeah.
How long did he try to stick to that?
I think actually the first year and a half, he kept saying to us, it has to just be a feature-length documentary. We can't make it longer.
I can. What? So I'm really curious. So what compelled him to say, okay, it's got to be 6 hours?
Well, I think we'll probably all want to talk about this, but I think in order to understand how Americans reacted, responded, and behaved from what we think the years of the Second World War are, whether it starts in 1939 or for Americans in 1941, in order to understand how they behaved then, you have to understand a little bit more about American history. So I think if we had explained that we barely get to Kristallnacht after the first show in a series entitled this, people might be surprised. But when you dig a little deeper into trying to understand something very complicated, you realize pretty quickly you have to go pretty far back.
Yeah. It's why I'm always telling my students, you need to understand the context. And of course, that's what the exhibit Americans in the Holocaust does also, because the first thing you see when you walk in is you see images of the Great Depression. So Becky, I'm really curious about your role. You seem, I know it says you're a historical consultant, but when I looked at the credits, your name stands out above the others. I know the other historians who are on the list as well. So could you talk about what it was like to work on the film and what you brought to the perspective of the film?
Sure. It was incredible to work on the film. I will never work with better people than Danny and with Sarah and Lynn and Ken, I think. So 2 projects right in a row that are kind of career-changing projects and pretty incredible ones. You asked about how it came to be 6 hours instead of 2. I think the team at Florentine Films is really great at actually listening to scholars. And when we said, oh no, you can't understand this unless you have this, they listened to that and added time to the schedule and time into the film to cover all of these things that Danny and Peter Hayes and I were saying were absolutely crucial. I think my name floated higher because I'm not running an institution like Danny is. And so to some extent, I had time to answer their questions as they were posing them, time to sit with them and really think through some of the maps and some of the artwork and some of the really nitty gritty details of how do we know this quote is the right quote? Are we absolutely sure that this number is the right number? I mean, everything in the film is just meticulously gone over and over and over. And it was such an honor to be able to be part of that process.
Your point about how careful the filmmakers were and the historians. And this, we live in a moment where often facts get debated, and it's very clear that this was a project that is so deeply rooted in the history and the historiography. And for me personally, somebody watching from the outside, it was very exciting because I've read the books by all the talking heads on screen. And so I knew, what they were saying. But there were also, I have to say, that watching it, and I know this history because I do teach the history of the Holocaust, that there were so many moments that were really not necessarily revelatory for me, but I expected would be surprising to the audience. And I was wondering how you made some of those choices. So, and I don't know what you call them in film. Do you call it episodes or chapters? But do you have like a favorite moment that you were using to advance the story, but that you also expected would be surprising? So I'd love to hear the episode that each one of you would like to talk about. So since we started with Danny before, maybe we'll start with Sarah this time.
Well, I'm going to answer before I answer that question, I just want to say, to piggyback on a little bit what Becky was just saying and what you were just saying, I think, first of all, the power of historical documentary filmmaking, you were just, we'll lean into that for a second, which is that you can, write a really meaningful book and a really important essay, and you can study a subject over and over again. But when you bring together, for this topic, because it took place largely in the 20th century, documentary evidence, still photography, moving images, how they use those in an exhibition, even more than in an exhibition, you can bring together elements that are very powerful in telling a story and make that story feel new and different. And in doing so for the film, we really needed to do 2 things. One is to find scholars, some of whom many people expect to hear from, some of whom are lesser known and people don't expect to hear from. And then to figure out what are the personal stories that we will interweave with the scholarship, so that you're, as a viewer and a consumer, you're constantly going between the context of history and the personal stake of history. And that is so central to what we do. And I think they did some of that in the exhibition. Becky does some of that in her work. Historians understand that that can be very powerful for your audience or your reader. And, you know, one of the things I love about working with Ken and Jeff Ward is, you know, we do make fairly traditional historical documentaries, and God is our dramatist. We work chronologically. We want to understand history. We feel like it's important to march through, not thematically, but march through with chronology on our side. And so I think we should all talk about the moments in the exhibition and in the film that are surprising, both in terms of their history and the visuals. And I think also talk about documentary evidence and how careful we are in showing what we show, when we show it, and why, and how we work with advisors, not only on this project, but on many projects. And then I'm sure we all have surprising and favorite moments. I'd love to hear yours also, but I just think it's important for people to understand how we put these things together with the history and the art of filmmaking, and use the elements that go into that.
Yeah, I mean, as a historian, I'm always in awe of what documentary filmmakers can do. But you're right. What makes a documentary film so much more powerful than just reading a book is that it combines the evidence with the personal. And you, writing does that too.
Right. And you can put, I mean, I always say it's, you know, you can put people who don't normally like to even be in the same state together at a dinner table having a conversation. And that's also really an amazing privilege to be able to do that at work.
Yeah. Okay. So Danny, what about you? What do you?
Well, I mean, this is a hard one. This is kind of like, what's your favorite child question? Because there's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of great moments in the film. But you know, if I had to pick one, I've really been thinking a lot about that period between 1938 and 1941, and I think the film captures the desperation of Jews to leave Europe at that time, with some of the rich context of the United States. I think one of the brilliant things about this film is how you're on both sides of the Atlantic. You're in the United States and you're in Europe. And so, you know, after the Anschluss, after the Nazis go into Austria in the spring of 1938, I think it's obviously a real turning point for Jews in Europe, but it's also a real turning point for Americans in understanding, for example, that the Nazis have greater territorial ambitions beyond Germany. So the tension is really amped up, both for Jews in Europe trying to get out, and you see during that period between 1938 and 1941, the State Department put in new restrictions on immigration, for example, right? So as Jews in Europe are becoming more desperate, we see the US government start to become even more closed off because of a looming impending war that they assume is coming, right? So that period kind of between the Anschluss in spring of 1938 and Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941, I think the tensions are so heightened. And then what's so fascinating in that period, which we tried to show in the exhibition based on some really amazing new research that Becky did, is actually how many refugees did make it in during that tense period. And I think I've heard this directly from a lot of people, not really realizing there were other ships besides the St. Louis, for example, right? So we're telling a much, you know, the refugee story is such a just passion of mine to study during this period. And I think in looking at that specific period between 1938 and 1941, there's such fantastic examples in this film. And then, of course, I'm sure we'll talk about this more, they grounded in these personal, emotional stories that I think are really what you remember when you leave the film.
Right. I so agree. It's so interesting to kind of explore that period that often, you know, kind of gets jumped over. Certainly when one is teaching and talking, because you kind of jump from, you know, okay, the war breaks out in 39, and then in U.S. history starts getting, you know, people go to the end of 41 right away. And of course, in your exhibit, you did something amazing about that, where you put how many people were on the waiting list on the floor of the exhibition. So there is this visceral moment where you can, as somebody walking through a museum, understand what it would have been like. So Becky, how about you? What's something jumps out for you?
Well, before I answer that, I just want to say that this is why it was really great that the filmmakers were interested in the film and in doing the film in 2015, but had other films to work on and didn't really get back to it until 2018, because by the time they came back to us, we had all of this new research that a lot of it were still unanswered questions before that. And there's still, of course, many, many unanswered questions. So if anybody out there is interested in research, please reach out to me and I can give you a whole host of different dissertation topics that you can explore. To me, I think the film captured something that was really surprising, I think, the first time that I saw it. And then by the time the film actually came out, I think is just spectacular and something that I've never seen before, which is really weaving the war and the Holocaust together. This tension between Hitler's territorial ambitions and where Jews physically lived is something that, I know the museum has tried to weave together, and that we've tried to work with students to understand that this is a history that is not lived twice. We don't go through World War II and then we go through the Holocaust, that for people who are going through it, they're experiencing them at the same time. And the film does such an amazing job with maps, with particularly Peter Hayes's commentary, talking about the importance of geography to how Americans understood this, whether they believed it or not. I think that's something that was accomplished in this film in a way that I've never seen before.
Right. I agree. I mean, that's why I was asking what was the right term, because what was so stunning about the film was that there would be America in this particular year, and then it was Europe, and you would go back and forth in a way that you're right. When we're reading or we're lecturing, we can't weave it together the way the film could do, so that you got that story so powerfully and so quickly. So I know that when you're writing a book, you're making a documentary, I imagine in the documentary a lot ends up on the cutting floor. So what stories were cut that you wished you could have included? Sarah, do you want to start?
Well, yeah, that's always a complicated question. I actually have answered this in the reverse recently, which is to talk about the last things we included in the film, because we are changing the film up until the very last moment, and there were some major tiny changes that we did at the very end. So I might answer with what we added before I talk about what I think we took out that would have been great to have audiences know. One of the last things we did was to add what we refer to internally as the last letters, which were, you see them in episodes 2 and 3, where you hear from people who know they're going to die and they need and want to be remembered. And while that doesn't necessarily immediately feel like an American, right? We're making a film about America and the Holocaust, so we're constantly trying to make sure we're sticking to the topic and not making yet another Holocaust documentary. Or I think that was a huge challenge, actually, when we set out to make the film. Funders, people who are interested would say to us, why do we need another anything about the Holocaust? We would say, actually, this is really different. And to think about this subject through the lens of the American experience. So 2 things happened in making the film. We realized in order to understand the American reaction we actually had to understand the Holocaust and the history of it, and that many, many, many Americans don't have a really grounded history of the persecution of the Jews of Europe. I think if you go to a dinner party and you ask, people know that 6 million Jews died. They think they probably died in Germany, and they don't understand how many German and Austrian Jews got here, how many Jews from different parts of the world that they don't often think about perished. And so while we were doing that, we then realized, how do we personalize and represent those people who are not representable in the traditional ways? There aren't members of their families here to tell their stories. They didn't make it to America. No one in their family made it to America. They didn't even have relatives in America to get here in certain instances. So we included, thanks to a beautiful book that Yad Vashem put together called Last Letters, 3 different moments in the film where you hear from somebody who knows they're going to die. So we put those in at the end, and they're some of my favorite moments in the film. And letters are very important in documentaries. So one thing I was very sad to have go with actually a suggestion that Becky made to us at our first script meeting, which in discussions about how to represent the Jewish community here in America is not a monolith. Jews reacted different ways for different reasons at different times during this conflict. That's extremely important, always to understand and make sure people think about that, you know, like the great American tradition of writing to your president, right? What do you do if you're a citizen who's unhappy? You write to your elected official and try to make them change policy. And there were a bunch of children who wrote to President Roosevelt saying, please help the Jews of Europe. And we had one of those terrific letters from a kid in a yeshiva writing to President Roosevelt. And it just felt like one too many notes, and you understood that point. So we took it out, and it's a great letter. And that's something I think would have been fun to include if we'd had more time.
I remember those letters that you were talking about that you did include, and they brought tears to my eyes. I mean, they were just utterly heartbreaking. And as you said, there were people who knew they were going to die, but they wanted their families to remember them. So powerful. Becky, did you have something that ended up that didn't make it that you wanted to get in?
I mean, I made a list for them at one point of these are all of the little stories that, you know, different scholars have explored that aren't mentioned in the film. And I couldn't make a strong case for including any of them, I think. And so I think that's fine. I mean, this could have been a 20-hour film if we had actually explored everything that was happening. As I said, there's worlds to explore in this history that either haven't been explored by scholars or have been explored very deeply by scholars that end up, you know, just a couple of words in this film. This is one thing that when we're talking about making documentary films, I think we also have to acknowledge the sheer brilliance of Jeffrey Ward, who is able to take this vast amount of scholarship and make the one sentence that contains all of the perfect words to summarize that period in a way that is correct. It's incredibly hard to do. I think if you took the entire script and printed it out without the music cues, it would maybe be 100 pages. And to get at that amount of history, that minutely, that powerfully in that short amount of time, relatively, I think they did an incredible job, and I don't have any major gaps that I stay up at night about.
Right. It is an amazing skill to be able to condense the complexities of history that many of us spend hundreds of pages on, and to get that down into something manageable. And it's absolutely essential because, you know, so often we write our books for our colleagues, but this was a project that had to reach much more widely. Danny, how about you? Did you have something that got cut that you would have liked to have seen?
Well, I mean, I'll say I'm so envious of Jeffrey Ward. I wish I could think and write like Jeffrey Ward. You know, in thinking about it's easier for me to talk about this in terms of the exhibition, but, you know, I'm sure Sarah could give an equivalent for the film as well. It was very difficult in the exhibition to determine which refugees did we want to focus on who were trying to get out, and which rescuers. We tell stories of refugees and rescuers, and we had, as you said, it was a small space. We had 5,000 square feet, and so we ended up, you know, telling deeper stories of 8 refugees in the exhibition. Some who make it out, and some who didn't, and 5 rescuers. You know, and some are organizations, and some are individuals. And then there's great stories. There were great stories of rescue that maybe were lesser known stories that get left out. You know, one of my mentors at the museum always said, though, you know it's getting really good when you're cutting some of the things that you really love, right? And that's usually true, but it is. There are so many additional stories, you know, as powerful as the stories of refugees and rescuers are in the film and the exhibition, there's so many more that could have been told. So I do think about some of those people whose stories didn't make it in.
Right. So I think for so many of us who work on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, that this is really a personal project. It goes way beyond our mandate to be objective historians or dispassionate filmmakers. I actually recall reading, Sarah, that you were surprised that you didn't know your family history. You didn't know how many family members had been lost in the Holocaust, and until you actually made the film. So I'm curious, is there a personal story I'd like to ask each of you that drove your work on the film? Is there something personal that drove your work on the film? Sarah, do you want to start?
I'm happy to start. Yeah. Well, I mean, I sort of maintain that I've never worked on a film about a subject I know very much about, and I'm very glad that I can say that. My first film was on the history of jazz, and I knew very little about jazz. I didn't know much about the history of Prohibition or Ernest Hemingway, and I think we all, Jeff, Ken, Lynn, and I all approach any film we work on as if we know almost nothing, virtually nothing. So we're learning a subject anew. Having said that, on my father's side, I'm a first generation American, and I grew up around a lot of, not folklore, but family stories about this history and relatives, but I didn't really understand it grounded in the history. So the thing I learned the most about were, to Danny's point and Becky's point, like individual cousins and wings of my family, and where were they, and those names suddenly took new meaning, not just that my great uncle was in the Warsaw Uprising or something, like the way memory works, and the way the trauma of the people who did make it here. My family came in 1949 thanks to Hias, is interesting for anyone. So I think we all, any Jewish person in America, and I've heard this from lots of viewers, and we've gotten a lot of response of, oh, even Lynn will say she didn't think she had any relatives because it was sort of one cousin wing disconnected from who she grew up around. So once you scratch the surface, I think most Jews in America have some connection to this history, even if it doesn't seem as direct as you might imagine. But for me, what I didn't quite understand is, I had my great uncle Leon was a major force in the Warsaw Uprising. And my great grandfather, who I did know very well and got to Mexico City thanks to the Joint, had a sister. And when her children were taken from the ghetto, she killed herself. Mm. And I never knew that she had committed suicide in the ghetto until working on this film and really going through family pictures and trying to understand what exactly happened to each of them. And that's very powerful to me in a way, to just try to show the dignity and agency and the ways that the Jews who were stuck tried to act and behave, and the choices that they made, I think, are very, very interesting.
Oh, that's such a powerful, powerful story. I'll ask Becky if there's something, personal that has led you to devote, your career to working on studying the Holocaust, and maybe also want to tell the audience, it doesn't appear in the film, but about the blueberries and the album from the Auschwitz album, because I've watched you do a short film on that as well.
Yeah, so I have a very different family history than Sarah. My family has no connection to the Holocaust. I'm not Jewish. I came to this history because I visited the Holocaust Museum with my Girl Scout troop when I was 12. And that's how I became a Holocaust historian. And so I approached this history really as an American without any personal history or family history with it. And I think for me, I came to the field of American response because I was looking for the fights. I had always heard that Americans didn't know anything, Americans didn't do anything. And I thought, well, that doesn't track with my understanding of Americans. The idea that Americans are not arguing about this, that we're speaking with one voice, that didn't make any sense to me. And so when I discovered the history of the War Refugee Board, which is the agency that my first book is about and that I studied, this government agency that was tasked in 1944 with trying to rescue the Jews of Europe, that was very interesting to me because it showed that there was change over time. It showed that there were battles, and that, to me, the right people won those battles at the right moment. And so my thought was, if we have forgotten them, if we have erased them from the story, then we we don't have the opportunity to learn from what they did. And so I was really gratified that this was included in the film. You mentioned the story of the blueberries. So I was in the archives of the museum for 12 years, and my job was to work with new donations, people who were finding things in their attics and bringing them to the museum. It was fantastic training for a historian because you're only looking at primary sources. And whatever comes in that day, it could be a letter from the Warsaw Ghetto, it could be refugee papers, it could be survivor testimony. It was a whole host of different things. And in this instance, it turned out to be the photograph album owned by the adjutant to the final commandant of Auschwitz. So it's personal photos of life inside Auschwitz for the command staff of the camp in the summer and fall of 1944. And so in an earlier career, I had a long experience working with those photo albums and kind of sharing, our ideas of perpetrators and how these photographs kind of both challenge and reinforce our understanding of human nature.
Right, and it does so powerfully where the people who are working at Auschwitz are pretending to cry because they've run out of blueberries.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, it's really, really powerful. Danny, how about you? Personal connection?
For me, I think about the moment that we're living in, and the privilege of knowing survivors well, right? So that my first position at the library, I was still an undergraduate student. I was an intern. Sorry, at the Holocaust Museum. I was an undergraduate. The museum had been open for a year, and I was an intern in the oral history department. At that point, survivors were just walking in off the street every day to tell their story. And my job was to sit and record and listen to stories. And that was an amazing privilege. And now, of course, we're living in a moment where, most people younger than us won't have that privilege of really knowing survivors well. And I think about that even within now my own family. My wife's grandmother was a survivor who left Germany in 1939 under some harrowing circumstances. I knew her well and have the privilege to talk to her about her history. And I learned while I was working on this exhibition that my mother's family took in a refugee child in St. Louis in the 1930s. And that's a survivor that I didn't know, right? So I think this notion of knowing survivors well, and then sometimes trying to kind of chase, if you will, the stories of survivors who have intersected with our lives who we don't know well, feels very personal to me.
Right. Yeah. Sarah said you only tell the stories of a few survivors in the film because you had to make really, really hard choices. So I want to ask you about the end of the film, because the final 5 minutes where you bring this story of exclusion and discrimination right up to today, and all of a sudden, we're looking at hate crimes and hate-filled marches from the past couple of years, and what you did was you connected the past to the present, and you make history come to life because you're also reminding us that we're making history right now. And so I was really curious, did you always know the film was going to go there? That's probably for Sarah, but I'm also curious about Becky and Danny, if what you thought about the gut punch ending. So maybe I'll start with Sarah to see if she always knew the film was going to end that way.
Well, thank you for asking that. I will say that how we start any film and how we end any film tend to be some of the last things that we finish editing. So we did not know exactly how the film was going to start, and we absolutely did not know how the film was going to end. And Becky and Danny can both talk about some of the conversations we had internally, creatively in our editing group, and then with all of the scholars. And I think the choices of when and how to end the film may seem obvious now that you've seen the film, but are we going to end in 1945? Are we going to end in 1965 when Johnson changes our immigration policy from what it was when it became very restrictive in 1924? Are we going to go into some period in the 80s and 90s where we begin to think about refugees differently, late 70s, 80s, 90s? are we going to go to today? And typically, anyone who's familiar with our work, we don't actually get as contemporary as we do in this film. And so over the course of the last year of editing, I think it became clear, and I'm going to give most of this to Ken, who really felt very strongly that we needed to deal with and think about where we are as a country now, and how what happened over the course of making the film from 2015 when we decided to make it until now, both here and around the world, is shocking and terrifying when you're studying this history. So there actually became quite a bit of urgency when we were in the last year of editing about some of the history in the film that we were telling, and the urgency that he felt, PBS felt, we all felt. And so once we made the decision that we wanted the film to deal with some of what is happening here domestically, we then had to decide what things to include. And our first pass, we actually included a lot more than ends up in the final edit. And we made the choices in what is in the final edit because we wanted, with the lens of history, for them to be directly related to the 6 hours of film you just saw. So anti-Semitism here and around the world is having a very interesting moment, which I cannot wait to hear what Danny and Becky have to say about that, but also how you put anti-Semitism into the conversation about the nativist, xenophobic, racist, very complicated history that we have. And then, to Danny's opening statement, hopefully ask our audiences to think about American history differently, to think about this time in American history differently, and to think about what they can be doing now in response to this rise of a more authoritarian, fascist, xenophobic, nativist, racist, anti-Semitic, very important aspect of American life that we often shy away from talking about.
Amazing. Becky.
Yeah, I mean, endings are really hard. We had a very hard time trying to figure out when to end the exhibition in Washington. And we finally kind of, I think, cheated a little bit and said, well, the Holocaust ends in 1945. And so we're going to end in 1945. Because as Sarah said, if you talk about displaced persons camps, you know, the last one closes in 1957. If you want to go to when we have a comprehensive refugee policy, such as it is, that's 1980. You know, how far and where do you go? I also think it's important to add that, just for Danny and I particularly, that when we were advising the filmmakers, we were doing that in our personal capacity, not as representatives of the museum. And that was both important to the museum and important to the filmmakers, I think, so that, you know, they didn't feel like the museum was putting a thumb on the scale. Danny and I are both experts in this field, and so the filmmakers used us in our personal capacities for this. In terms of the end, you know, this is a story about human nature, and this is a story about some of the big questions that we have that Danny gets to at the beginning of the film about what it is to be an American. What are our roles and responsibilities in the world? What do we do when people are being persecuted abroad or at home? And I think you see that in the ending. I think it asks those questions in a really powerful way. And I think it brings the film into a relevancy that you know, people aren't just looking at this as this is a memorial film. No, this is a film about action. This is a film about you living through history. What are you going to do now?
Danny?
Well, Sarah said the word urgency, and I do look. I mean, I've been steeped in this history for 25 years, but I do think it has a real and particular urgency right now. I think you know, in the exhibition and in the film, in a way, we're trying to bust some myths, right? So I think very often about something that Peter Hayes says in the film, that we both are a nation of immigrants, and that keeping immigrants out has been as American as apple pie. And I think in coming to, those are Peter's words in the film, I think is how he says it. I wouldn't want viewers to think that was true in the past, but it's not true anymore. It's still true. right? Just as when we're teaching Holocaust history, I mean, Pam, you know this better than anyone with the work that you're working on right now. We would love to think that Hitler gives anti-Semitism as a bad name and there's no anti-Semitism anymore. But of course, history is much more troubling than that, right? And now we're seeing this particular rise of anti-Semitism, not only over there, but here in a way that is making use of Nazi symbols and ideas that were compelling to the Nazis. And I think to not call that out in the film would have been troubling. But it kind of gives the lie to the idea that we're better than the folks we study in the past, right? They're just as complex as we are now. And we shouldn't approach history that way and thinking, oh, those were quaint times or we know better now. It's not true. It's not true.
Right. Yeah. As Danny was alluding, I'm currently writing a history of American anti-Semitism, and it is a long, long history. And we are, I mean, I sometimes wonder, historians, as everyone on here knows, they would call the period between World War I and World War II in the United States used to be called the high tide of American anti-Semitism. And I won't be around in 30 years to see what historians are going to call this moment, but I really wonder if this will be marked as the high tide of American anti-Semitism and not that period. So we are going to turn to questions.
So, Pam, when I'm teaching now, I say it's the high tide of American anti-Semitism in the 20th century.
20th century, right, exactly,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We always, just for those of you who posted questions, just so you know, we always give priority to our students. I'm delighted to see that several of the students in my class have written questions. I'm going to start with one from Eliza Schloss, who actually this morning, I teach a course on the history of anti-Semitism. We happen to be talking about Holocaust denial today. So Eliza's question is coming after that conversation. Was there any intention to create this film in response to Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism in the U.S.? Do you hope this film reaches this audience? So I don't know.
I'll work my way backwards and say we definitely hope the film reaches that audience. And we definitely did not make the film because of Holocaust denial or in response to anti-Semitism. I think that's, it quickly became an interesting theme in the film, and Deborah Lipstadt is a major force in the series and a dear friend to all of us. And I'll leave any deep questions about Holocaust denial to her, honestly. But I think more important to us is, two things. One, that when you make a documentary film and you have the evidence, denial is harder to suggest. But also, I think what we're seeing now, which I never thought about to Eliza's question, is how people who are in the business of denial and want to use this subject and repurpose it for their cause is very frightening. So how documentary evidence, testimony, and history is turned backward
and inverted.
Very, very scary. And inverted was the word I was looking for, exactly.
Yeah.
That's more troubling. But I don't know, Danny, Becky?
No.
Well, I mean, this is not my idea, but Deborah Lipstadt always talks about how important it is to note for students that denial is motivated by anti-Semitism, and so we talk about this in the film that anti-Semites will tell contradictory stories about Jews, and it doesn't matter to them, right? And so you see that with denial. You see people denying that the Holocaust has happened, and then you see deniers celebrating that the Holocaust has happened, right? So as an object lesson in anti-Semitism and how illogical anti-Semitism is, you can see that in denial as well. But I think it's important, especially with people who haven't really thought about denial, to just begin with denial is motivated by anti-Semitism.
Right. Actually, the students this morning had read the chapters in Anti-Semitism Here and Now, her book on denial, and that's what we had been talking about. So we have a question from another one of my students, Tyler Eliadis. He said, with the vast rise of anti-Semitism happening nowadays, do you see any similarities between now and the 1930s, 1940s? I think the end of the film gets towards that, but maybe somebody wants to elaborate on that.
I think you see the rise of demagogues using their platforms to spread anti-Semitism. You know, back then it was Charles Coughlin on the radio. Now it is demagogues on different media channels and using social media particularly to reach into people's homes and spread this kind of hatred. And the way that people can gravitate towards just the voices that are spreading that is something that is really troubling, and I think very similar. I don't know that it's unique to now and the 30s and 40s. I think you could have found that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s too. But that is certainly a commonality, is that there are major figures spreading this into people's homes.
Right. And also the technology, like you mentioned, Father Charles Coughlin, and what was the technology of the 1930s and 40s? It was the radio. So the radio preacher, and today, of course, it's social media. And you just have to open the newspaper to find out how that's been used in the past week or so. So Lane Schnell and Dinah Schoen, also from the class, they wrote a question together. Were there any American citizens or institutions that either collaborated with the Nazis or helped save Jews that particularly surprised you?
Yeah, Danny, go. I'm gonna point out something amazing about the exhibition in relation to that question, but you start.
No, you start, Sarah. Go ahead. No? Okay.
I love it when people say amazing things about the exhibit. Come on.
Right. I was only going to say that I think it's important, and this happens in the film and it happens in the exhibition, to tell stories about non-Jewish rescuers, right? People who aided Jews were taking huge risks. Sometimes they were financial risks. Sometimes it was, think about what it means to take a foster child into your home, right? That changes your life on a daily, on a moment to moment basis, right? These are not small actions that people were taking. And then there are some stories of people who then risk their lives to aid Jews. And I was always I'm moved by all the stories, but moved by stories of non-Jews doing that, especially, right? I often wonder, and this is a question that I have trouble answering in the primary sources, is why? Why take the risks? It's so much easier not to take a risk. So to see some of those individuals, we tell stories of people, and Ken Burns has worked on a film on the Sharps, for example, Martha and Wait Still Sharp. I mean, that's just to name one example. We could name many of non-Jews who aid Jews, and I think it's a lesson for us today as we see different groups being persecuted over time. That one must not only be a member of that group to aid someone from that group.
Sarah?
One of the things I think people have commented on in terms of the film is in the 1930s, where you see, as Hitler is coming to power, a rise of a neo-Nazi citizenry here. And you see documentary footage of the Bund rally in New Jersey, for example. And people think that's unusual and kind of an outlier, whereas in the exhibition they turn that around, and as you come through that first room you see that it was actually the exception for a community to say, we won't stand for this, we are going to push against these anti-Semitic neo-Nazi Bund camps. And so I think the exhibition does a great job of kind of showing how normal something that we thought in 2015 was wildly surprising. And we're seeing that again now, kind of an acceptance of rhetoric. And, yes, you're seeing people with big platforms expressing very upsetting anti-Semitic rhetoric on the channels that we now have in 2022. But you have to remember, Father Coughlin, I think there are not a lot of radio stations. There were very few ways to, so I think the number of people who listened to Father Coughlin would surprise your students, because there was, like in the time when there were 3 networks on television, everybody's watching the same thing. You're not curating what you're listening to or watching based on your interests. This is the information you're getting, and Father Coughlin had a pretty big platform.
Yeah, he had an enormous platform. There's actually an amazing podcast series that the journalist Andrew Lapin did called Radioactive. And I'm bringing Lapin to one of my classes to talk about it.
Incredible.
Incredible. Yeah. The students have asked questions, so I'm going to take one or two. We have like 5 more minutes. I'm going to take 1 or 2 more from other panelists, but I won't give their names because they're identified because of the way this is. But the students' names I gave. So this is an interesting question. The questioner says, I was hoping the panelists might respond to Ruth Weiss's critique of the production and her claim that, quote, none of the lessons that Davidovich thinks history teaches us can be derived from either the Holocaust Museum in Washington or from the present documentary series based upon it, end quote. And that, quote, when our schools and media emphasize American failure over American achievement, they burrow at the foundations of the Republic, close quote. Any thoughts? I mean, I'm sure this is not the only criticism the series has gotten.
I don't necessarily agree with the premise that we're emphasizing American failure. I think we're trying. I shouldn't say we, but the filmmakers. I think they're trying. My read of it is they're trying to tell a much more complex story of American history than we have in the past, and that we should wrestle with that history. And I think there's a key moment in the film that's a little bit more of a meta moment about history that Nell Irvin Painter says. I think it's early on when she says, if we're going to celebrate American achievement, which I think we should, right? And Ken and Lynn and Sarah, in so many ways, in so many films, have celebrated American creativity and American achievement. And yet, this is also part of the story of American history. And then even within this film, the film and the exhibition are very careful to say that the United States took in more refugees than any other sovereign nation in the world, right? And yet, we shouldn't look away from the difficult parts of the history. So I think there's a danger in taking productions like this film or productions like the exhibition and then trying to kind of feed them through our really polarized political discourse today. And maybe that's inevitable, that's going to happen. But I think what Nell Painter says at that moment is so brilliant. Of course, we should celebrate American achievement, which we do, and we should also tell these stories. They're both part of American history.
Just like we were the great country that helped save the world against the fascist situation. I mean, to Becky, how you understand this time period and America's role in the Second World War militarily and the humanitarian crisis, both and all things can be true at the same time. And the more we understand that, hopefully the better we are informed for the future. For me, it's the same as, do you teach, to Nell's point and to Danny's point, a complicated, difficult past to make a more optimistic and bright future? My answer would be yes. They don't take away from each other. Understanding things are both good and bad. We did some things well, some things less well. We should always strive to do better. Seems like the great American principle. So that's how I would answer that. Both things can be true at the same time, always. That's what it means to live the human experience.
Yeah, a history cannot be black and white. It is gray, because it depends on who you talk to and whose experience you're elevating as to whether, the United States was somebody who took you in, or whether the United States was a country that rejected your visa. I think of something that Ken says, which is that if you are an exceptional athlete, what do? Is you look at the tape and you find the places where you can improve. And if we are an exceptional country, then we need to look at the tape.
Oh, that's such a great answer. All of them were just amazing, because of course history is about the complexity of the past, and the film very much is very fairly balanced. So I have a final question for you that's coming from me. When the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum opened in Washington, I remember that people said, "Where is the Anne Frank room?" And everybody expected that there would be an entire room devoted to Anne Frank. And you opened the film with the Frank family. I would love to know how you decided to do that.
I'll take that to start and then throw it. I think thanks to some research through YIVO, which is a great organization right down the street from our office, the Otto Frank papers came to light while you guys, what year did that
it was first... a little earlier than us. It was like 2008 or so, I think.
Right. And it was the American University professor, Richard Brightman, who was working on it.
Yeah. Yes. So when, but because we were starting to think about the film, it came to our attention that the Frank family tried to get to America. So if you're going to make a film about the U.S. response to the Holocaust, and you're going to take arguably most people's entry point to this subject, which is Anne Frank, and put her squarely in the American experience, that felt like an interesting thing to learn more about. And then once we saw his papers, read his letters, began to think about Anne Frank a little differently, we all got really interested in her story and why it matters for an American audience and why it matters in the history of the Holocaust. And so I hope we've done a good job of explaining both those things, that Otto Frank is on the record of wanting to get here. He had the right contacts, he had the right money, he had the right access to potentially get here. And then because of the dynamics of the war and because of how hard it was to get here, they did not make it. And then to think about her diary and why she's important a little differently.
Yeah, wonderful, and so powerful and so relatable. So I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Sarah Botstein and Danny Green and Rebecca Erbelding for joining us today. And this will be made available. It's been recorded and will be put up on the Center for Israel Studies site at American University. And we look forward to your next film and to your next books. So thank you so much for joining us. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Pam.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.